Long ago, in the distant future, where evil knights joust upon beasts of the air, you too must fly, joust, and retrieve the enemy's egg before it hatches, and beware the lava below. You can experience this world from the other side. It's called Joust, the arcade game, home now only from Atari. A video game? Hardly. Joust. You don't play it, you live it.
Joust was truly brilliant in its simplicity, not only for its time, but even for today. Think about some of the games that are rising to prominence on the indie scene. They fall into many categories, but one of those categories are simple games that are easy to pick up and understand, sometimes with only a single button press or a single way to interact with the game itself. But the challenge and brilliance comes in the nuance and understanding of when to execute that single button press. Joust is the same, only 40 years prior. It was released in the arcades back in the year of 1982, and had players riding an ostrich or a buzzard or something that you could elevate by pressing a button to flap its wings. Not pressing the button would allow you to descend, and of course you can move it around the screen with a joystick. Again, brilliant in its simplicity and surprisingly deep in strategy, Joust became an arcade hit. So it only made sense to bring it home to the early consoles of the time, and to port it even well beyond that. But I personally have always associated Joust with Atari and Atari consoles, even though it was actually developed and published by Williams Electronics. So in this long-awaited return of Dare to Compare, we are going to look at many different versions of Joust on Atari platforms. I currently have access to the Atari 2600, 5200, 7800, Lynx, the 8-bit computer, and the Atari ST port that was brought to the Jaguar by homebrew and hobbyist programmers. We are going to compare these games in a few key areas. Those areas being graphics, sound, gameplay, presentation, and of course, fun, in an effort to crown which version is the must-play release of Joust. With all that said, we have a lot to cover, so let's not delay in getting started. Let's dare to compare Joust on Atari platforms. Presentation in this scenario encompasses the title screen, HUD, or display of the relevant information for the game, such as scores and lives, along with any menus. The 2600 is as simple as you would expect, but unlike some of the earlier games on the console, Joust does have a relatively pleasant title screen. And that's to say that, well, a lot of earlier games had no title screen at all. The 2600 version does a great job of displaying the relevant information, especially when taking into account the limitations of that console. The 7800 presentation is excellent in my opinion. All the relevant information is clear and concise, and it's pleasing to the eyes overall. You can also easily select your difficulty and players by pressing left, right, up, or down on the controller. You would expect the presentation of the 5200 version to be somewhere in between the last two, and well, it is. The title screen isn't as nice as on the Atari 7800, but it's definitely improved over its predecessor, and all the relevant information is once again easy to read and digest. When it comes to Atari computer ports, some people will be surprised to hear that the 5200 version and the 8-bit version are essentially identical, but that's because the 5200 is closely related to the Atari 8-bit computers. So this makes porting games between the two an easy and simple process. So when it comes to presentation, well, the Atari 8-bit is the 5200 version. But the Atari ST port, well, it's pretty different. And remember, I'm experiencing this ST version by way of the Jaguar port. But the presentation is not as grand as I would have liked. It feels lesser than even the 7800 version in some ways. But it still features a main menu where you can choose one or two players while staring at a nice large Joust logo, and all the HUD information is presented in a clear manner. But when it comes to presentation, I think the Atari Lynx wins. All of the title screens are very similar if I'm honest, but I like the presentation of the Lynx version the most. Its small details like the Joust logo extending beyond the rectangle on the title screen, and the same information as in other versions are just conveyed, well, just as effectively. But presentation is probably the category that holds the least weight. So let's move into something a little more important, like the graphics and sound. You would think the newest console would have the best graphics and sound. And in terms of graphics, well, you would be right. The Atari Jaguar has larger sprites with a fair amount of detail and color. They look good on my CRT TV, and they animate pretty well. I especially like the green wings on the enemy buzzards. It just looks good. But when it comes to sound, well, I felt disappointed by the Jaguar ST port. It just sounds abrasive most of the time, but there are a few good sound effects here and there, like when you dismount another jouster and collect their eggs. But the rest of the sounds, well, they're not great, and even the wing flap sound is weak. The 2600 port sounds as you would expect for the console, and the 7800 port isn't half bad either, considering that it's using the same sound chip, but neither the 2600 nor the 7800 version stands out. The graphics on the 2600 are actually fairly good for the console, but that version, along with the 5200 version, uses single color for the player sprites and the enemy sprites. The 5200 version looks odd in my opinion. If I didn't know better, I'd think the buzzards had two heads, because the wings and the rider are a solid color and lack any real details. The 7800, despite the sound that is best described as middling, has some pretty good detail on the jousters. The riders and the birds each have separate colors, and the details look pretty good overall. The Lynx version, well, it doesn't look quite as nice as I was hoping, and not as nice as the 7800 version in my opinion, but there is still a nice variety of colors used in the Lynx version that attempts to give each sprite some added details. If I had to rank things graphically, I would make the Jaguar/ST port the winner, followed by the 7800, Lynx, 2600, and rounded out with the 5200 and 8-bit ports. And that's honestly funny, because in the audio category, well, the 8-bit computer port, and thus the 5200 version, would be the winner. The sounds are very different from any other port that I've played, but they're honestly upbeat and pleasant to the ears. And maybe it's because they are so unique from the rest that I have to give it the tip of my hat. I like it, but there's no accounting for taste. Let me know if you guys agree. But beyond presentation, and even graphics and sound, I think the most important categories are the fun factor and the gameplay. So let's move on to the last category before we determine which port of Joust is the ultimate version on Atari platforms. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Joust is a simple idea, and the gameplay is relatively simple as well. The button presses can provide different amounts of elevation, and momentum gained by moving can be a bit different. Heck, you can even plummet faster or slower, depending which version of the game you're playing. So in this category, I think I'll start with the versions I like the least, and the ones that played the worst in my opinion. And I'm not sure if it's because the Jaguar port is sloppy, or if the actual ST version is the same, but I think the Jag/ST port is the worst gameplay-wise. Why? Because I experience slowdown when too many sprites get on the screen at once, believe it or not. And it's not so bad that it's unplayable, and it's not super noticeable just by viewing the gameplay. It's mostly in the feeling of the delay of the controls and in the flapping. Otherwise, the Jaguar version would play absolutely fine. But I had more fun with the Jaguar version than the Lynx one, which is my lowest scoring for fun factor. Now again, there's no accounting for taste, but in my opinion, the riders feel too stiff to control and too heavy to fly. And don't get me wrong, even the least fun version of Joust on Atari consoles is still pretty fun in my opinion. I legitimately enjoyed the Lynx version, but I got the least amount of enjoyment out of it. Well, that and the Jaguar versions. The middle-of-the-road ports of Joust, in my opinion, are the Atari 2600 versions, along with the 5200 and 8-bit ports. They control fine, but the 2600 version, as with many arcade ports on the console, make compromises to pull the gameplay off on the console. The jousters float onto the screen from the left and the right, rather than appearing on set platforms. And the same thing happens with the eggs, as they never permanently land and sit on the ground. But still, even given the compromises, they did a really good job on this port. And it is a lot of fun to play. It controls well. And the same things can be said for the 5200 and 8-bit ports. The 8-bit port more so than the 5200 version, because of the superior controller. Plus, the 5200 has an oddity, where when you return to life after being killed, You have to flap in order to start moving, rather than just moving the joystick left or right like in any other version. So because of that, the 8-bit version is ranked just a little bit higher than the 5200 one. But the winner for fun and gameplay, in my opinion, is the Atari 7800 port. And maybe it's because of my bias. Maybe it's because that's the version I grew up playing. But the 7800 version of Joust is just really good. It feels perfect to me in terms of control, and flying your buzzard across the screen, knocking down enemy riders, and even in fighting the pterodactyl. So we have a different winner in essentially every category. The Atari Lynx version has the best presentation, the 5200 and 8-bit ports have the best sound, the Atari Jaguar /ST port looks the best, and the Atari 7800 is the most fun to play and has the best gameplay in my opinion. So, which is the best port? Well, it might be a cop-out, but if I'm honest, they're all good. Not a single one of them is bad, and I would be happy if I was stuck with just any one of them. The 2600 port of Joust is impressive for the hardware, and they did an excellent job bringing it to such a limited console. The 5200 and 8-bit port is fantastic. It's a great step up from the 2600, and is mostly solid, with just the graphics being a little wonky in my opinion. The 7800 version is just so good. It's another game I can pick up and play on a whim, and I know I'm gonna have a good time. The Jaguar /ST port does have the slowdown, which is a bummer, but it's not bad by any means. It's just the worst compared to the rest, as I was able to adapt and still have a good time despite that flaw. And again, the Jaguar ST port, well, it honestly looks the best. And the Lynx version is absolutely fine. It just feels a bit heavier than the rest in my opinion, and some people might prefer that. So if I had to pick a winner, well, I personally would choose the 7800 port. But you have to believe me when I say that they are all good, and worthy of owning if you collect for that particular Atari console. So there you have it. Joust is just a good and fun game for Atari consoles overall. It was synonymous with Atari in my opinion, and I couldn't picture owning an Atari game system or computer without owning a copy of Joust. But I've talked enough about these ports. Now I want to hear about your opinions. Did I do justice to these games? Did I compare them properly, or was I off in my evaluation somewhere? And do you agree with my choices for the winners of each category? Do you think the 7800 is the best version of Joust on Atari platforms? Let me know your thoughts and opinions on all this, and anything else in the comments down below. And make sure to let me know what version of Joust is your favorite. I'm curious to hear what y'all think. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. We put out 2 videos a week, so hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we upload. The Atari Network also has a Discord if you want to continue the discussion after the video. Link is in the description. And you can also head over to patreon.com/7800progamer if you want to support the channel. I have a $2 and $5 tier, along with YouTube memberships for $5. Members get access to exclusive audio updates, videos, streams, and watch-alongs. I try to post one unique piece of exclusive content a week, and your support goes a long way in growing the channel. And I want to say thank you to all the classy Atarians who are already supporting the Atari Network. You guys rock, and I couldn't do this without you. And with that, it's time to wrap up another edition of Dare to Compare. This one was a fair bit of work, so I hope you enjoyed it. I've been the 7800 Pro Gamer, a jouster riding on the back of a battle ostrich here at the Atari Network, and I want to thank you all for watching. And until next time, remember to stay classy, Atarians.